Our next presentation is measuring performance and how to choose meaningful metrics. So we have Boris Arratia here from General Services Administration. He's the senior advisor there at the GSA's Office of Shared Solutions and Performance Improvement. He works with agency and cross-agency teams to design and deliver collaborative initiatives that advance progress towards solving complex cross-cutting federal government challenges as part of the PMA. For example, he is currently supporting a cross-agency team that is working to improve the American public's experience with federal services. Please join me in welcoming Boris. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kim. And it's great seeing so many familiar faces here as we've been having a really great conversation on the whole business of strategy and looking at goals and kind of pulling it all of that together with Adam. We had Chris, we had Lenore, and we had David too. I'm not sure if they're here, but even having David in the panel reminded me this is really a stellar event. That was really bad. Stellar, of course. But I have enjoyed working with many of you in this room. And what I want to do, the first thing I want to say is as I share with you, so I'm coming with my views and having done a lot of work. This is not an official GSA view per se, but I just wanted to make sure that we're just clear as we go about here. So we're sharing a lot of best practices. And I just want to make sure that this becomes something that's really practical for you. So as I have a few minutes here, and really before lunch is me, so I'm very aware of that. So my job is to increase your appetite for meaningful metrics. Do you like that one, Robin? Okay, yeah, all right. All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Here on Wednesdays and Thursdays, don't forget. This business is really, it can get complicated. And one of the things in my career is really try to simplify things, making them easy to understand. We've got a lot of different stakeholders represented here. We're talking headquarters, we're talking agency, and then also bureau level. And I want to say a lot of those of you who are joining on the Adobe Connect on the webinar, we want you to keep you engaged as well, keep asking questions. And so I just want to, first of all, say that the objective I have here, the few minutes that I'm going to be sharing with you, so two things I want to do. The first thing is I want to inspire you to really go out there, capture and share the good things that you're doing in your programs, every one of you. And even just looking around the room and the folks in the webinar really gives me a great inspiration myself to just do the things that we do, because we're all, at the end of the day, we're trying to really improve the way we deliver services to the citizens. And so the other thing is I want to give you a process as well that is going to be easy to understand. It's born not of theory. There's a little logic modeling that's in here, and some of you here that you know exactly what I'm talking about. Other ones here, it's like, oh, what are you talking about? But it's really looking at cause and effect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but it's really more about giving you something practical. So I want to do those two things, inspire you and then give you some practical things that you can start doing tomorrow. There's a lot of good stuff here in the afternoon, so don't get super inspired and start working on your metrics right away. So wait till at least tomorrow. So, before we get too far into this, the first thing one would ask is, why do we measure? So we've been talking a lot about strategy. We're looking at how to pull things together. And coming from, so I spent a lot of time doing CPI, Lean Six, process improvement, and there's always, ways to improve. But I think you got to look at the plans that we just talked about. How are we going to track that we're actually on track? And how are we going to make sure that we're delivering good quality work? And the last question there is, are we focusing on the right things? So these are the types of questions that we want to ask before you start with anything. It's a good idea to ask why. And so when it comes to meaning, and I've got a lot of slides here, so I'm going to pause in a few of them, but I just wanted to make sure, so don't be alarmed by the sheer number of slides. I wanted to give you something that you could actually use. But when it comes to what makes a metric meaningful, there's a lot we can say, and again, there's books that are written about this topic, but I really boil it down, and this is experience working with cross-agency priority goal teams, working with some of the agents. Some of you here in the room, I've had the pleasure to work with your teams and do some facilitating as well, Robin, yeah, recently. But it's really about linking to desired outcomes. So if you remember one thing from what I'm saying, I want you to remember that statement, because it's really where we're trying to get to here. The other things that are important as well, but I want to make sure that you also think about being easy to understand, appropriate for the audience, and incentivizing the right behavior. So I heard Lenora talk about, yes, we want to make sure that we're measuring results, but let's not forget about behaviors. What is it that we want to be able to see at the end of the day? So that's really important. And then the other thing is we don't want to forget is quality. Do we have quality metrics? Having done this for a while, doesn't happen overnight. So quality is a process. So you're going to sometimes collect data, get some metrics, and they don't necessarily reflect what's really happening. And so you're going to have to do a couple cycles till you get there. So don't be alarmed. It's not going to be great quality at the top, but it's something that comes with time. So don't give up. So there are other things that will make a metric meaningful. I'm sure you can think of other things. But I want to make this real personal right now. So I want you to pause for a minute here. It's not a minute of silence, but I want you to think about your role right now in a program or initiative. And I just want you to take about a minute to think about 2 or 3 things that you really care about, things that you're measuring right now that really make a difference to you. I know we're coming to the end of a performance cycle. Maybe you're thinking about your performance plan and how am I going to do with that conversation? But maybe there's that. But think about 1 or 2 metrics that you really care about right now. And then I want you to think about why. So there's a table here. If you're in the webinar, just take a minute or so to kind of think about that and jot down 1 or 2 metrics, because I want to use that in some of the other things I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to stop talking for about a minute, give you about a minute to write 1 or 2 things that you're measuring right now that you really care about for a program or an initiative. Go. Okay, and as you're writing that, also think about why do you care? I mean, why should we care? We asked about that earlier, but why do you care about that metric? What makes it relevant to you? Okay, and the last thing in this metric is, regardless of what it is that you just thought about, you're going to have different roles. You're going to be the person producing the data. You're going to be the evaluator. You're going to be using it in some way, or the decision maker or consumer of that data. So there's always different roles that you play, or perhaps you don't play any of those roles. So thinking about that's important too. All right, you got your metric in hand? Great, okay, see you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your last statement?
So the last thing that I said is, as you thought about that metric or 2 or 3 that you care about, why you care about them, then the last thing is, are you producing the data to measure that metric, or is someone else doing that? Or perhaps you're the decision maker that's going to use that data to make some decisions. Yeah. Okay, so what I want to say is, so we talked a little bit about the why and the meaningful. When you talk about meaningful, when it comes right down to it, again, in this business for a while, it comes down to 3 things when you're looking at measures. And I don't know if Adam was here. Maybe he'll agree. I don't know. Maybe he might throw a couple of the things here. But I really look at it as we're always going to be answering questions from stakeholders, and we're dealing with all kinds of stakeholders. So the organization that I work for at GSA, so we support both cross-agency priority goal teams. We do some work with agency priority goal teams as well. But then also we support executive councils. That's a lot of what my office does. The PIC being one of them. I see a lot of fellow PIC members and friends here, which is really good to see. But we're always asking that, are we answering the right questions? And are we giving the stakeholders the things that they're looking for? Are we managing our work? That's the other thing that metrics really help us do. And then are we providing transparency? So we talked about that as well. There's other things, but if I were to say 3 things, this is what I would say. So moving from there, what I want to do next is I want to lay here a process that I'm going to say is tried and true. So we've done this a number of times, and just even looking around the room, I've worked with a couple of you doing this process, teaching it, but also applying it. And a lot of the perspective I'm going to share here is the facilitator perspective. So a lot of the work that I do at GSA, so I help facilitate a lot of the discussions that happen, both within GSA and then cross-agency as well. So I want to give you that perspective because what I hope you will do is this is something that you can take and work with your teams. So laying this out in a way that a facilitator would think about, I think it would be helpful for you to take it and export it to where you're going to use it. So we don't get too far in this conversation without talking about outcomes. We've been talking about that already, and that really becomes that first stopping point here. There's a set of questions here. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I wanted to just put in there because these are very questions that have been thought out carefully to kind of guide this conversation. And you're going to start with your stakeholders. If you don't really have a good grasp on the stakeholders, I recommend that you do have some kind of a stakeholder analysis. And this is a basic project management 101, but it's also very basic to when we're talking about strategy, goals, vision, mission, and then metrics. Thinking about the outcomes that matter to them. Again, you may need to go, hey, shocker, you may need to talk to some stakeholders and ask them what matters to you. And that's some of the things that Lenora and Chris were talking about. You get out there and you talk to people, find out what is it that makes them tick. Then you're going to try to figure out, we talked about behaviors as well. So that's another key point that I want to make today. Behavior piece is really important because a question that we'd ask, what are the behaviors that we can observe that indicate these outcomes are actually happening? So that's a really important thing, and I want to illustrate with a couple examples. So we do that, and notice we haven't touched metrics yet. So we're going to do that conversation. So this is the thoughtful part of it, and when you do this, I recommend doing it as a team. Again, we talked about whether you do it by yourself or you're working with a team. And then you enter the metrics conversation with a solid foundation. So when you get into that second block, you're really looking at, how do we validate these observations? Again, a roundabout, maybe touchy-feely way of dealing with it, but I found doing this for a number of years that it really works when you start talking about behaviors and data. What data do you need to validate things are happening? And so you go from there, and then you're going to flow into the last block, which is planning, and this is where you basically say, okay, how are we going to define this metric? Very important. A definition that makes sense to everybody, that everybody can agree to, but it's also something that we will be able to get the data and actually consistently get the data and be able to track our performance. So we're going to do that in the planning phase. So one quote that I like to use when I'm talking about this is I like from a quote from Andy Stanley, the author, and it is direction, not intention, determines destination. Not my quote, this is Andy Stanley. So direction, not intention, determines destination. And I really think that really applies in the business that we have been talking about here today. So when we start with this process, I want to unpack it a little bit because I want to take us through, again, how you will be facilitating this measures development process. So in the first stage, we're looking very closely at our stakeholders. This is a topic perhaps for another day. Stakeholder analysis is kind of near and dear to my heart. So we do a lot of that in the things that we work with in our team, trying to figure out who is who, and there is a pecking order, as we know. When we're looking at stakeholders, which ones are we going to focus in this next cycle? And so you want to have those hard conversations sometimes, but then you're going to be asking what matters to them. What are the things that are important to them, and what are the outcomes that they expect to get? So when I'm facilitating this conversation, I'm asking teams, we've got a lot of different outcomes we can put up on the walls, and we got stickies. When I saw these white walls, I almost grabbed a Sharpie and start writing, because in GSA we have a lot of white walls, so I will try not to do that, not get you in trouble. All right. Oh yeah, here we go. Go to town. Yeah. So we're going to be asking a lot of those questions, but we're going to synthesize outcome statements. This is perhaps the most important part of this process, because this is really the thing that we're trying to get to. And I want to define outcomes a little more. I know we have that conversation oftentimes. But we're going to have that process of synthesis. And typically, I like to work with teams and getting down to 3. There's no scientific method here, but I found that much more than that tends to make it harder for people to focus. 3 is about right. Too few from that, sometimes it makes it not as good for looking at a broad range of things. So 3 is about the right number, not magic, but that I found that works well. after we have this conversation on outcomes, I first want to differentiate. When we're talking about outputs, we've been talking a little bit about this already. We're really looking at scale. We're looking at volume and the things that we're delivering. We're not necessarily looking at the quality or the things that make it special, or really is it getting to what we're trying to accomplish. That's really when we talk about outcomes. Again, we have a lot of conversation on this, but I found this is a good way to differentiate things. So we're describing in outcomes the intended result of the program or the project or the activity. And it's going to help us assess the success of the program. We're actually getting to where we're trying to get to. So a little more practical way to show, I've got a couple examples here. Well, let's take this event here. By the way, I want to recognize Kim for putting this together. This is really cool because we do this a lot in GSA, and the more we do this, the better it is for all of us. So thank you.
I had one question. One question from the chat was, can you describe what the value proposition is?
So value proposition, not something I was going to get into here too much, but I'm going to just give you a kind of a nickel tour of that. So the value proposition is really asking the question, what is our value add to this customer? And sometimes you'll have that. So there's a whole conversation you could have in value proposition. And that really ties more into developing your mission, vision, and goals. But typically, value proposition is asking that question, what is the value add? If my organization disappear, will they miss us? Okay. So with this example here, so this conference, if we're looking at an activity, so the activity itself is we're holding this conference, this seminar, this event. An output of that will be the number of people that are here in the room, people that are in the chat, in the webinar. But then also we're looking at the topics we cover. So we're measuring the scale, and all of those things are important. But if I want to look at the outcome side of this matrix, perhaps I'm looking for the number of programs, initiatives, or projects that benefited from information that was gathered at this conference. So that's a little more of an outcome base where I'm looking, what is the value of pulling these people together, or perhaps the number of partnerships that were born. I've made a lot of friends in events like this, and then we end up working together. So that's more of an outcome base. And so I wanted to give you that perspective as we're thinking about, and don't overthink it now, but that's just a kind of a simple way to just kind of differentiate the two. So the next part of the conversation really comes to behaviors. And I really like this one because when you have some great outcome statements on the wall, you got this big stick. We use these big stickers, which I love. You got these great outcome statements. Everybody agree. Now you want to give it some context. So what are we really talking about? So I love the question is, what are the observable behaviors that indicate this outcome is happening? And I'll illustrate with a couple examples in a minute. So we have that second conversation. We still haven't talked about metrics yet. Keep that in mind. So we have that conversation of observable behaviors, and then we're trying to get to, again, providing that sort of meaning, giving that meaning, that outcome some meaning. So I want to use a couple examples. So worked with a couple of cross-agency priority goal teams. Actually, these were from the previous administration, where we were looking at the security clearance and reform process. And with the team, cross-agency team from different agencies, we generated 3 outcome statements here: efficiency, quality, effectiveness. And so the words might look kind of, oh, that's pretty broad. Does that mean anything? Well, it means a lot to the people that were in the room that we're working with. So, and Robin is laughing there, yeah, but it means a lot to the people that are working on this. So if you look at effectiveness, so let's look at that one there. The security, solubility, and credentialing processes reduce adverse incidents from insiders. So that's an outcome statement. Again, this is not an agency perspective, it's a cross-agency perspective. So we're looking at the community as a whole. And so when I do a little more of a deep dive on that into observable behavior, so we had that conversation. Now we were looking at 3 different observable behaviors. So I wanted to highlight the first. The SSC community as a whole can show how well it identifies hostile actors and validates good actors. So that gets to giving a little more context. We've got a couple other statements here, but that's where you begin to ask, what do we want to be able to observe? So another, maybe a more simple example, if you got kids are going back to school, it's been a long time for me and my wife, but anyway, a lot of you have young kids that are going out. Yeah, not dating myself here. And so when you maybe a desired outcome is healthy bodies through nutritious lunch, right? So when you pack the carrot sticks in the box, and observable behaviors, they ate the carrot sticks. And you say, wait a minute, maybe they just gave them to their friends and they got a Snickers bar, right? They did some trading, that kind of thing. but that's a little bit of the logic here. So we're trying to, again, this is what I want to accomplish. What is it that I can observe? You're trying to look things that you could actually observe. Another example, so we worked with a cross-agency group that was looking at the SES core, and it was looking at metrics for measuring the strength of the SES core. And this is, again, an initiative from the previous administration. And we were looking at some outcome statements. So I want to focus on accountability, the last one there. So one of the things that the team came up with is we want to be able to hold senior executives accountable for achieving results in support of mission success. So that kind of sounds broad, means a lot to the people that were in the room as we were building these statements. And so as we unpack that one into the observable behavior, here we have accountability. We're looking at a couple of things. So there is a regular and consistent feedback process. Okay, so I have got something that I can observe, not only in one agency, but actually can observe that across the agency. So we have that conversation, again, before we enter the realm of the metric. So the next piece is here, this is very sequential. One thing I want to pause here and say that when you're doing this in real life, you're going to iterate. So I didn't want to, again, having done a lot of process improvement over the years, I'd like to draw little process maps, but it's really cyclical and you're going to iterate at every step. So over here, you ask the question, all right, great. So I know the outcomes, I know the behaviors. So what data do I need to validate these behaviors are actually happening? And so that's where then you begin to look at some metric ideas. Perhaps you're already measuring things, and so you're going to look at your existing metrics for sure, but then you're going to start generating ideas. So this becomes a brainstorming process. And I like to use the funnel idea here where you're really looking for what are going to be that short list. So one of the things I heard Lenora say is you're looking for small amounts of metrics that will really tell the story, capture the story that you're trying to tell. And so as you're going through this funnel process, there is different activities you can use for brainstorming. And one activity that I like is the could, can, and will. It's an old brainstorming activity, but we asked it first, so we will break it up into 3 time slots. So we've got our outcomes, we got our observable behaviors, you put those on the wall with your team. So the first question you're asked for a few minutes, okay, what could you measure? This is anything goes. I don't care about the data, whether I can get it. I don't care how hard it's going to be to measure this thing. Let's just think outside the box. And that's the could question. So you spend a couple minutes, stickies again, flying on the walls here. The next question is, what can you measure? So you're bringing down the funnel a little bit more. Here's more like, okay, I know this is going to be hard to do, but I know we can do it. Actually, we have the people, we have systems we can upgrade. And then you get down to, let's talk turkey here. What is it? Yeah, close to lunch. I maybe shouldn't use the word turkey here. But I know, sorry. What will you measure gets down to, okay, what are those narrow types of things that we really want to focus on? And so what you're going for here is quantities. Any of those of you run brainstorming, we're looking for quantities. And then you're going to have some things to look at. Now, after you've done that activity, I like to think about this process again as you're going to be iterating, you're going to be engaging stakeholders, and you're going to be asking typically 3 areas here. I call it the 3 M's, which is really meaningful, measurable, and movable. So within each of these, so these are the types of things that are going to help you narrow down the list. What is it that we really want to focus in measuring here? The first thing, I said it when we started this conversation, does it link to desired outcomes? Super important. Is it going to give us information to make decisions, right? And so you go on, so on and so forth. And as you're going through this process, again, this is iterative, but you're trying to narrow your field down. You're also going to look at your existing metrics, and perhaps some of your existing metrics are doing this, but maybe they're not doing this. And if the metric that I asked you to think about before, and if you're thinking about, okay, what are the outcomes that we're trying to get to, what are observable behaviors? So you may want to question that metric if it's not really working for you, right? Okay, so this is what we will do to sort of iterate. So I'm going to go back to the 2 examples. The first one, where again, we're looking for that metric ideas for the security, suitability, and credentialing process. So one of the things the team came up with is the SSC process effectiveness. So that means absolutely nothing by looking at that, but it means a lot to that team because I'm going to show you a couple steps on how to actually define these metrics. Then we have investigation effectiveness, reporting effectiveness. So each one of these went through another process of definition to really nail it down. What are we talking about? And then for the SES Strengthening Initiative, we had a couple of them. One of the metric ideas was, let's use what Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey is already producing. So we have a very rich data source, has multiple years, and there's a couple of questions there that link exactly to where we're trying to go. So we were able to leverage something that was already being done. And then you see the other metric ideas. Again, so this is very quickly, I kind of run you through the process here, a facilitated process, again, that I've seen work very effectively, particularly when we're working with complex types of things. So when you get to this point, the question comes up, all right, so I'm there. I've got a good idea of my outcomes are. I'm looking at my observable behaviors, the things I want to be able to see. And now I've got some ideas on metrics. Maybe I have 5 metrics. Maybe I have 10, depending on the number of outcomes. Before you get to that step, I wanted to go back to the slide because when you have your set of metrics, then you're going to go back to your outcome statements. Remember, we had 3 outcome statements. Let's say that you were looking at a program that ended up. You're going to go back, okay, do these metrics really link to that outcome? The behaviors would give us some context. I'm not so worried about this point, about that, because that was just a step to get to the metric ideas. But now the outcomes are important. So you want to look at that and test them. You know, that first question, does it link to the desired outcomes? Really keep asking that question as you go. So you get to this step, and normally by the time you get here, one thing that I would recommend is before you spend the time to define a metric, take the time to really sift through, because this takes time. This is laborious, and this is going to take some time. So you want to get down to the point where you're, really not a whole lot of metrics, but you're going to spend the effort to really define this metric and to think about the measurement approach. What is the measurement approach that we're going to take? So these are templates that we use all the time. In fact, this past week, I was facilitating a couple groups at GSA that were doing exactly this. So I've seen it work at a fairly low level as far as a fairly complex multi-agency level. So the typical questions that we're asking here is, okay, how do we define this metric? So when we're saying, let's say that there was a project that I was working at GSA where we're looking at the onboarding experience for new employees. And so one of the metrics we're looking at is the number of employees that get a functioning PC on day 1. Okay, how many of you showed up? Somebody's laughing. Yeah, I got a PC, I can get to work. Excellent. So we're measuring that. So we're defining, what are we talking about? So this is really the ability for an employee to get a computer on the first day and for them to be able to at least do email at a minimum. So we put that definition in there. What's the purpose? How's it linked to desired outcomes? Desired outcome is we want to make the new employee experience onboarding, the new employee onboarding experience, a pleasant one. So that was one of the outcomes. So that links to that for sure. Owner and audience. Here we're looking at who owns that. I heard the term ownership in the previous conversation. This is really important, and I think Chris was talking about that too. When you think about this, there's going to be an ownership piece, and the more you have a clean line of who actually is the one that owns this metric, the easier it's going to be. She's absolutely right. The easier it is going to be to get to some results. I've seen teams that really take this serious, really do some great things, particularly with the desired outcomes. They really took the time to define desired outcomes. So then the last question in the definition template is it relevant? How is it going to help me make decisions? So if you have trouble answering any of these questions as you're developing the metric, then you might need to go back to the drawing board. Do I have the right metric before you even go any further here? So that's the beauty of this. So you're going to use that process. You may not have all the right people necessarily in the room, but you're going to then engage other folks as you're going along. So you dive a little deeper once you kind of have an idea of how you're going to define this metric. And now you start asking deeper questions such as, okay, where's the data going to come from? Who's got the data? How we're going to collect it. So data collection, that was the whole thing. So many of you who work in some kind of performance improvement initiative, or you've done it in the past, you know that usually you're going to have to come out with a metric somehow. You're going to be able to say, the current stays here, future stays here, so I need to be able to see if we got better. So this is really about sometimes having a data collection plan. If I don't have the data, how are we going to collect data? So there's a lot that happens here. Then the next thing is about how you're going to disaggregate. What are the groupings of this data that are meaningful to the people that you're working with. Then you're going into the more granular things like how are we going to report this, how often we're going to do it. So it's a conversation that you're going to have as you're trying to define the metric. And the last but not least is what are some of the barriers that I could have in trying to actually pull this thing together, pull it off in a way that's going to help us. If those barriers are unsurmountable, perhaps you go back to the drawing board or you look at some of the other ideas, because for this year, even though it's a great idea, links to the desired outcomes, I might need to postpone that one maybe till I have conditions that will allow me to do this. Sometimes that's the decision. So this is, again, a process that you're going to use to build metrics. I wanted to really give you the thinking process more than really getting into the nuts and bolts here, because that's the part that I'm really interested in you taking away from here.
We just had one question from the chat.
Sure.
When you define accountability, do you define it in accordance with desired behaviors?
So when we're defining accountability, make sure I understand. So observable behaviors are really there to give context to the outcome. So accountability, if we're talking about what we have here in terms of who owns the metric, we're really looking at who is going to be the main person that's going to have control on what happens in the inputs that go into that metric. It's just really who has the control. And sometimes the answer to that is multiple stakeholders. There's multiple players that have control. And then you sort of have to allocate what is my piece, right? So sometimes it's really not the whole thing, but what is my contribution? Make sense? Okay. So with all of the things that I talked about here, so the things I want you to walk away with, first of all, is you start with a focus in understanding your desired outcomes, where it is that you're going. You're going to think about your behaviors, the ones that you want to be able to observe to help you give context to that outcome. And then you're going to iterate, obviously, and this truly is a team process, something that you're going to do with a group of people. I don't recommend going it alone. Sometimes we do that, and sometimes that's the only option. I mean, I'll be realistic. Sometimes our teams are so small that we end up, that's real life, right, for us, all of us. But then you want to iterate. You bring other players in the mix here. And so that's really the key points that I have for a message here on the process. This is a much extended process that we've done in the past, but I just wanted to kind of consolidate it to a small piece here. So I have a couple of questions for you to think about. I want to entertain. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, actually, before you go into the discussion questions,
Okay.
there was another question from online, which I think probably a lot of people struggle with. How long do you collect information before it is considered valid and not just part of your baseline?
Okay, so that's a good point. Don't really have a real clear answer other than so let me back up a little bit. So there is target setting. I didn't talk about target setting. So when you have your metric, you're trying to set a baseline. This is a metric you've never done before. Let's just say this is something new. So you're trying to set a baseline. You're going to collect you look at some historical data. Perhaps you start collecting some data. At some point, you're going to say, okay, I'm ready to start collecting data from this point on. And I would say maybe a rule of thumb is when you feel like you have a system that's going to give you some reliable data, and that might take some iterations. Because once you have that baseline, you're also going to have a desired future state, and somewhere in that line, there's going to be a target that you're going for. That's not necessarily going to be on the desired future state. And so once you know what that baseline is and you say, okay, I've got some reliable way, at least collecting some quality data, I'm going to say that with a caveat, even in your best efforts, you may not necessarily get the quality data you thought you were going to get, because sometimes you're getting it from sources that you have no control on. That sound familiar? Right? So you're going to get the data, you're going to do your best, and then at some point, you're going to say, okay, I have a fairly reliable process for collecting the data. So that's a long answer. I don't know if I got to it. All right? So I do have a couple of questions to think about. I want to open it up to you all to see if you have any thoughts or questions or insights as we were just talking about this here. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi. A question that always comes up for me is how important is it to prove causality? And what I mean by that is maybe we achieve the outcome that we were after, and we did have metrics that link to that outcome, but what I don't have evidence of is what I did or what the project manager did is that what caused that outcome, or was it something completely extraneous to what we were doing?
Okay, so that gets into a little bit on the evaluation piece. So I'm collecting the data. I feel like I have decent quality data, and I feel like it's a good metric. It links to the outcome. And so as I'm looking at the information that's coming now, evaluation is going to help me, and that's topics we're going to get into this afternoon. But we're going to talk about, okay, what does it mean? And what is it really telling me? Because ultimately, you're trying to get to some outcome. And is that really helping me get there? So one thing that we do is root cause analysis. Sometimes I can kind of geeky a little bit with the process improvement stuff. So root cause analysis is really what is the root cause if there is something that's happening when I'm looking at that data that caused that to happen. So I would say typically that falls more into evaluation piece. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to add anything to that. Sure.
Oh, there's a button. There's a button on the side.
I think there is a button on the side. Yeah.
Logic model and your theory of change, because we just kind of own the fact that we don't know that the precise things that we're doing are leading to democracy in a country, right? But the whole point of coming up with a logic model is to say we think that these activities lead to these outputs, which lead to these outcomes, and we just sort of have to own the fact that there might not be some causal linkage there that we'll never be able to prove. But we always advise our bureaus to at least monitor and evaluate according to that logic, because that's the whole point. I think someone earlier said you're sort of testing, you have a hypothesis, you make a plan, and you're testing the hypothesis. That's exactly what they're doing. And so we just say, sometimes you can't, but the idea is that you go to the evaluation sometimes to see if all those things do add up to the bigger picture, but the first step is documenting the fact that you think these things add up to the bigger picture.
Right, that's a good point. And even though I didn't talk a lot about logic modeling, it is sometimes when I use that term, people say, oh, what are you talking about? But it's really some of the logic really is in this process. And that is, again, the inputs, the activities, the outputs, different levels of outcomes, short-term, mid-term, long-term, and then impacts. And you're looking at how, cause and effect. Yeah.
Actually, that is good for progress monitoring and even assessing the level of outcomes or of change that you have accomplished based on the project or intervention. But when we talk causality, it's always important a comparison group of some kind. The logic model is going to take you more to a process evaluation or outcome evaluation and the monitoring or even performance measurement, but not necessarily causality. For any kind of causality, you always have to have a comparison. It can be a control group, right, and it can be a semi-experimental design, and it is based on the comparison with something similar. And then just as outcomes. And even if you cannot see behaviors, you can look at least at attitudes, for instance, that reflect democracy or not in an area where they have not received the kind of project or intervention.
Okay, good point. Let's see. We have one here from the webinar.
We have a question. What metrics can you use to validate a process? For example, risk management, ROI, money spent to mitigate, number of red, yellow, and green risk.
Okay, so I will answer the question with a question. What's the desired outcome? So even in your ERM, your enterprise risk management, and think about what is the desired outcome that you're going after, and then let that guide the decision. Because you can collect all of those things, and they might give you a picture of what's happening, and there's something else that you're not collecting. So that would be my question. First of all, what is it that I'm trying to get to that's specific? I mean, we can be very general, but the beauty of outcomes is we're really trying to get more specific. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Let that be the answer. So what I wanted to leave you with here is some questions to think about as you're doing this work. And by the way, this is how we tell the story of the great things that are happening. So the thing I get passionate about this. I know sometimes eyes glaze over when you say metrics, but I get passionate about this because this is how you tell the story of all the good things that you're doing. So it's important that as you're doing that, think about, are you including your stakeholders? And some of you are saying, yep, we definitely are. And some of you are thinking, we could do better with that. So I'm going to challenge you to think about that, both internal and external, when you're thinking about what you're going to measure. The next question is, are the majority of people on your team agree that you're really measuring the right things? And you may or may not know this, and goes back to communicating and really asking people, and even down to the front line, you're measuring things, but are we really measuring the right stuff? Asking that question from time to time, not just because you're measuring it. And then this is an iterative process, so are you revising your metrics from time to time? And are they becoming easier to work with? Are they more clear as you're updating and upgrading your metrics as you go along? And then think about what is a great metric that you're currently using in your program. And is this something that I want to replicate as you're thinking about that? So that metric that I asked you to write down when you started, now you got some things to test it against, and I want you to do that. And that's my goal. So if you improve one metric out of this talk, I feel good.
We had a question online just asking about how do you know when you have enough metrics?
All right, so I'll go back to my question. All right, did it help you get to the that typically we measure more than we need to? That's what I've been my experience. We tend to overdo metrics. To be honest, I've few places where I've seen that, well, we don't have enough. Typically, I mean, that I shouldn't generalize, but most of the times I see us measuring more than we really need to. So it really comes down to, is it helping you answer your stakeholder questions? Is it really helping you manage the work? And is it really giving you the transparency that you need? So I would say that should guide you. If you have, I'd say more than 10 metrics, I'm going to throw a number out there that are linked to one specific project. Maybe you have too many, so I'm just using a blanket statement here. But it tested that way. Is it really answering the right questions? And is it something that is really going to help me make decisions? If you don't get good answers to those questions, then perhaps you want to question that metric. I realize sometimes you don't have a choice. You are being told you're going to measure this, right? So there's sometimes some of that tension that you're going to run into. Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions in the room? Okay, thank you so much, Boris. And if we have other questions for Boris, just email them to me.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to say we have a lot of resources in the PIC website. PIC resources, there is a couple of playbooks. We have some quick guides. The playbooks are particularly helpful. We spend a lot of time curating, collecting practices from you all, actually. And I want you to feel free to share. And then if you want to contact any of us, we have an email inbox. We got picstuff@gsa.gov, and that will get to me, and it will get to my colleagues as well. And that will certainly help folks in thinking through this whole process. So picstuff@gsa.gov will get to me and others. Thank you.